To do a deep, deep dive into all the homes, and we're going to need the resources to do that. And that's why I'm asking for the federal government to help us and support us, because I just don't believe it's all of them, but I believe there's more than 5.
Why all this surprise? Okay, you get the call for help from Premier Doug Ford to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. He says he's imploring the federal government to help fix the province's long-term care system after the release of this scathing, tragic, scary report on 5 facilities from the Canadian military. But it is interesting, as you just heard in our previous segment, Doug Ford could have known this, but they had cut inspections. Why didn't they know? Why did it take the military to reveal something that the union representing healthcare workers in Ontario was talking about last year, that the Auditor General talked about in 2015 under a Liberal government? And can the government, the Liberal federal government, afford to help after months of COVID spending? And if it's happening in Ontario, are we waiting for a military report in the long-term care homes they helped out in Quebec? Yes, we are. The press gallery is going to weigh in. CTV Ottawa Bureau Chief Joyce Napier is here. So is Toronto Star reporter Tonda McCharles. And our special guest is the former NDP leader and the CTV News political analyst Tom Mulcair. Great to have all of you here. Hey, this took over the news, Tom. Shocking, disgraceful, tragic, but not surprising. What do you make of the reaction and the findings?
The reaction is strong because the findings are horrific. But we've known for some time, given the thousands of deaths, especially in Quebec and in Ontario, that the situation is indeed horrible. The real question is, who was responsible for licensing these places? Who was responsible for enforcing the regulations, the directives? That's why so many Canadians are saying now that the Canada Health Act should be expanded to include long-term care for seniors. I'm one who believes that it should be, and that the provinces and the feds now have a moral obligation in the wake of this tragedy to sit down and decide how that can happen. We had a deal in the 60s. There's no reason that we can't have a deal in the 2020s to deal exactly with that. How do we ensure that this care is there? It's a question of result, not means. So people who are arguing private versus public are missing the point. The real point is, who gives the license and who ensures that the regulations, that the directives, that all the norms and the standards are being met?
Tonda, there's accountability questions. I know there's a lot of politics. There's going to be a lot of calls for help for the federal government and the provincial government. What did you make of the report and the fallout?
The report is shocking, just as all your guests today have said. It's even if we've all been writing about long-term care homes, but to read the state of affairs inside these places amid a COVID pandemic it begs explanation and accountability. And I think that the Ontario government did miss a chance, actually, to make a strong political statement today in saying that they would strike an independent, judicially led inquiry into the state of affairs in Ontario. It's not good enough for them now to just say they've struck a review that's going to start in September. But I think that, as this is unfolding, we need people looking at it like the military were. They've only been extended for 30 days, but this needs eyes on it with a view to stricter regulation and enforcement. And, the debate around what Tom has raised about whether it should be under a federal law, an umbrella law to impose national standards. Yes, but that doesn't necessarily mean that enforcement. We've seen the Canada Health Act not enforced on occasion. So there's no guarantee either way, but there is now a need for political will to be expressed and followed up on.
Joyce, what's your sense of this? We've all known about this. The military exposes it, and suddenly there's a mad dash to try to fix it. What do you make of it all?
Well, I think that Dr. Jane Philpott has a point when she says all Canadians are complicit in this. Look, this is the report. It's not long. I think every Canadian should actually read it. There's one part where it says that some equipment hadn't been checked since 2014. So for those who think that this was just a COVID problem, the answer is actually this problem began way before COVID. And, whether they are for-profit or not for-profit, I think it is irrelevant. What is clear what is absolutely clear when you read this report, sadly and cynically, is that a lot of people just figure, well, these elderly people are sick, they're dying, and, nobody there to defend them. And it seems that, when you say that these workers are overworked, it is certainly the case. That they're underpaid, that is certainly the case. But why not wash your hands anyway? Because in one of these sections, it is reported that they don't wash their hands, so they're not clean. They leave catheters on the floor. I mean, it is beyond my understanding as to how you can do this, how these things can happen. And, the Premier of Ontario is calling almost for a police investigation now, talking about criminal negligence and, charges will be laid if. But, this is not one person's problem. You're not going to find one culprit. It is at so many levels there are culprits. And I think that we should all think about that.
Yeah, even Doug Ford said it doesn't cost much to clean, but there's more to that. Tom, that's the Ontario report. And again, the military's called in as the helper of last resort. They turn from helpers to whistleblowers. We're expecting a report out of Quebec. What do you expect there?
Oh, it'll probably be much the same, if not worse. In Quebec, we've got well over 4,000 deaths from COVID, more than 3,000 in our long-term residences. The horror stories started with a residence called Heron in Dorval, near the airport. Mr. Legault found nothing better to do than to attack that journalist, saying, well, that's maybe why Anglophones aren't listening to all the good news coming out of the Quebec government. By the way, there's an extra legal angle here. Doug Ford has suggested that we might be looking at things like criminal negligence causing death. But Canada has a very specific law to protect workers. It's called the Westray law, and it's after a mining disaster. Took a long time for it to get through. And workers are dying on the front lines here in Quebec and elsewhere in Canada. And I think that Crown prosecutors should, Evan, be looking at that as well. But that's not going to bring any of these people back. The government right now in Quebec is not being transparent. There's a big residence in Montreal called Maimonides. It is in the middle of a massive outbreak, and families haven't been able to get any new figures since last week. The government is not being transparent, is not providing information because they simply can't handle it, and they're not letting people know what's going on.
Yeah, just to remind people, Westray, the mine disaster in Nova Scotia, killed 26, 1992, and that forced governments to try to protect workers. Tonda, I know you wanted to jump in there. What did governments do now? There's a lot of outrage. We're going to investigate long-term care. What is the federal government's role here? I know this is shared jurisdiction, but provinces guard healthcare quite closely. What are the steps you expect to see?
Well, look, they can start by acting on some of the recommendations that have already been before them. Last fall, you had Dr. Samir Sinha on earlier, and he leads the National Institute on Aging. And last fall, they produced a dynamite report on what needs to be done for long-term care to be fixed in Canada. And they could start by looking at that and looking at its recommendations for fixing a system that doesn't take care of its own. I just want to say I agree with Joyce that the problems have been longstanding, and I would just note that, though, amidst the COVID pandemic, everything's been amplified, right? So the military report actually does outline a probable death caused by a failure of staff to sit people up while they were being basically force-fed. That seems to have clear negligence, clear criminal negligence involved. So there are actions that can be taken immediately. There are longer-term actions. I think that the other thing that's important to note amid the COVID pandemic, across Canada, it's a mix of systems. Yes, public, private, not-for-profit. Some municipalities pay, some don't. But there are also 8 million caregivers across Canada, unpaid people, family members, friends who go in and help out at these homes and help take care of their elderly loved ones. And they're not allowed in during the pandemic. So that's a whole unpaid labor force, if you will, that hasn't been present, eyes on, helping out. I have to think that also has hurt many of these situations.
Joyce, I just got about 20 seconds. Go ahead, Tom. I think Tom wanted to jump in.
And if you think about
There's another angle to what Tonda was saying there. 2 Thursdays ago, the Quebec government said if people got tested and they were the primary caregiver, they could go in. The very next day, they changed that. No longer needed testing, and they were letting anybody come in to visit. There were homes that I know of personally that were free of COVID that now have COVID because the government was opening the doors too fast. So it's a two-way street. We've got to be really careful about opening up because it could introduce COVID.
Absolutely.
All right, Joyce, you're a pro. You got 10 seconds, Joyce.
Okay, then the solution is not just throw money at the problem. The solution is look at the real problem, and it's a staffing problem, and fix that instead of just throwing money to the provinces and say, here, you deal with it, because they won't.
All right.